This is Radio Democracy, a series of 12 commentaries by the noted author and political analyst Michael Parenti. This segment is titled The Lazy Law and Social Control. The police and the law are dedicated less to fighting crime and more to defending the social-economic status quo.
Let's talk about the law today. Through most of the history of labor struggle, law officers have been on the side of the bosses. Police have either looked the other way or actively cooperated when company goons and vigilantes attacked union organizers and picketers. In recent years, in various parts of the country, police have attacked striking farm laborers, truckers, miners, meat packers, janitors, and factory and construction workers, arresting and injuring hundreds. Many workers have been imprisoned for resisting court injunctions against strikes and pickets, and even for shouting at scab workers or daring to talk back to police while on picket lines. In Elmwood, Indiana, 7 strikers were shot by company goons. A striking coal miner in Harlan County, Kentucky, was shot dead by a gun thug, as was another miner in McDowell County, West Virginia, and a farm worker in Texas. In none of these cases did police apprehend anyone, despite eyewitness evidence of the identity of the killers. Working people generally have very little reason to be happy about the law, and they have a lot of reason to complain about how the law is enforced. The law and its enforcement agents do many worthwhile things. I'll grant that. I'm very happy to say that many laws enhance public safety and individual security. The police sometimes protect life and limb, direct traffic, administer first aid, assist in times of community emergency, and perform other services with commendable dedication and courage. But aside from this desirable social service function, the police also serve a class control function. That is, they must protect those who rule from those who are ruled. And they protect the interests of capital and property, big property, from those who would challenge the inequities of the system, or those who advocate any kind of redistribution or reformist politics. The profiteering corporate managers, plundering slumlords, swindling merchants, racist school boards, special interest legislators, and others who contribute so much to the scarcity, misery, and anger that lead to individual crimes or mass riots, they leave the dirty work of subduing these outbursts to the police. When the police charge picket lines, beating, gassing, and occasionally shooting workers, they usually are operating with a court injunction that allows them to exert force in order to protect the interests of the corporate owners. The police confront dangers and social miseries of a kind most of us can only imagine. They deal with the damaged and oppressed products of a competitive, free market society, the ill-fed, the ill-housed, the desperate, and the defeated. The slums are not the problem, they are the solution. They are the way of dealing with the surplus people of a market economy. And it's the job of the police to sweep protest and poverty under the rug, even if it takes a gun. When directed toward social reforms that benefit the many, the law often appears ineffective. But when it's mobilized against political dissenters, the resources of the law appear boundless, and enforcement is pursued with a kind of vigor that itself becomes lawless. So, after a while, people learn that they're not as free as they might think. If they engage in progressive causes that challenge privileged interests, they risk being targeted for repression. One mechanism of repression is the grand jury, supposedly intended to weigh the state's evidence and protect the innocent from unjustifiable prosecution. The grand jury usually ends up doing whatever the prosecution wants. Grand juries have been used to conduct fishing expeditions against persons with unconventional political views, required to appear without benefit of counsel, without being told the nature of the investigation. Dissidents have been forced to answer questions about their political ideas, their personal associations, or face imprisonment for refusing. The upshot is to turn them into involuntary informers regarding any conversation or activity to which they have been privy. Another political control agency is the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, known affectionately to many of us, especially in mid-April. The IRS has gone after dissidents for purposes having little to do with tax collection. A General Accounting Office study found that some 28 civil rights leaders were audited repeatedly. The Communist Party had its assets seized and was illegally denied tax exemption for years, while the two major pro-capitalist parties, the Republicans and Democrats, or Democrats and Republicans as some people say, they enjoyed uninterrupted tax exemption. The IRS has investigated the Black Panther Party, Students for a Democratic Society, Socialist Worker Party, gay rights advocates, environmental groups, anti-war groups, liberal politicians, and many other politically oriented individuals, organizations, and publications. Not to get more taxes out of them or to keep them honest on taxes, but to harass them and use the tax laws as a way of hamstringing them. Loyalty and security checks have been used by government agencies to deny public employment to people of anti-capitalist persuasion. Private sector employees have no First Amendment protection from bosses who might fire them because of their political views. The right to political opinions, which by the way is a right in a country like the Netherlands, the right to have whatever political opinion you want without suffering deprivation or punishment does not exist in this country. Discrimination on the basis of race, class, or religious orientation is against the law, but not discrimination on the basis of your political views. The courts have ruled that the Constitution prohibits the government, but not private businesses or institutions, from suppressing speech. In other words, if your boss doesn't like your opinions about GATT or the environment or about minimum wage laws or about U.S. foreign policy, he can fire you if he wants to. People with affiliations to anti-capitalist groups have been hounded out of jobs in labor unions, academia, entertainment, industry, and various other fields by both private employers and government investigators. During the Vietnam War, protesters were attacked by police on dozens of campuses throughout the country and in major demonstrations in many cities. At Kent State, protesters were killed. In Orangeburg, in Jackson State, students were also killed. Many were wounded by police and guardsmen. From 1968 to 1971, police attacked the headquarters of the Black Panther Party, a Marxist revolutionary organization, in more than 10 cities. By the way, the Black Panther Party also was involved in breakfast programs, community help programs, and the like. In more than 10 cities, the police wrecked their offices, stole thousands of dollars in funds, and arrested, beat, and shot occupants in planned, unprovoked attacks coordinated with the FBI, attacks in which more than 40 Panthers were murdered by police in that period, including Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton, who was shot dead while asleep in his bed. The suppression of community activists is a form of counterinsurgency, a way of keeping people victimized. A Chicago community worker observed as follows, I quote from a letter she wrote to me, "I remember the police harassment assisted by the FBI. If it were not for their cruel and unjust campaign, there would probably be a top-notch Democratic community organization here, led by citizens groups and the Black Panthers. The leaders instead are all dead or in Marion prison, Puerto Rican and black, and the near West Side is still a disaster in spirit and physically. The despair that followed paved the way for drug traffickers to stake out the territory, and the feds helped them. To this day, kids are threatened from a very young age, and the family unit is fragmented by deplorable employment and housing policies." Unquote. So from a class control perspective, a demoralized, disorganized community is far more easily subjugated than a community operating with democratic unity and strength. You know, we're taught that in the United States there are no political prisoners. But in fact, we've endured a long history of politically motivated jailings. The great American labor leader Eugene Victor Debs and some 6,000 other socialists, pacifists, and radical labor organizers were imprisoned or deported during the First World War or immediately afterward in what was known as the Palmer raids. That was the Attorney General Palmer just going around the country rounding up people whose opinions he didn't like. The anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and eventually executed for a crime most investigators and historians say they never committed. These two immigrants were killed because they were anarchists. Numerous African American leaders involved in progressive community causes and struggles against drug pushers were railroaded into prison on trumped-up charges. Martin Sostre, Frank Shufford, Eddie Carthen, Ben Chavis. In many of these cases, the police actually planted drugs on the community organizer who was fighting drugs to railroad them into jail, where they suffered astronomical prison sentences, solitary confinement and beatings and other mistreatment. But in contrast, the police seemed curiously protective of drug dealers. Leaders of black men's movement against crack in New York were spied on, harassed, arrested, and convicted of illegal possession of weapons, attempted escape, and assault, charges they repeatedly denied. Native American Indian activists Timothy Jacobs and Eddie Hatcher took over a Robeson County, North Carolina newspaper office one day to bring attention to rampant police corruption, drug dealing, racism, and murder by officials. Tried in federal court for kidnapping, they were acquitted. Tried again for the same action in state court, they were sentenced to prison for 25-year terms. There's the case of the Crips leader in Los Angeles, Dwayne Holmes, who brought peace between the gangs in L.A. and who was caught on trumped-up charges. Some provocateurs came to a community event that he was sponsoring and said that he stole $10. 20 witnesses said he did no such thing, and the police believed the provocateurs, arrested Dwayne Holmes. He had got a court-appointed lawyer who refused to call any of his defense witnesses. The lawyer was later made head of the Bar Association in that area, and Dwayne Holmes was sentenced to and is now serving 7 years in prison for this $10 theft, which he never committed. Prison inmates who propagate anti-capitalist or black nationalist views, or Latino nationalist or Puerto Rican nationalist views, who engage in prison protests have been singled out for mind control programs. Prisoners like the socialist Stephen Kessler, charged with disrupting a federal penitentiary by, quote, promoting racial unity, collectivizing the inmate population, attempting to secure legislative inquiries into prison conditions, and being involved with outside radical groups. Now, all those things I thought were part of his democratic rights and sounded like some pretty good things, too, promoting racial unity. But instead, Kessler, for his efforts, was placed in a behavior modification unit to be subjected to mind-altering drugs, beatings, forced rectal searches, prolonged shackling, isolation, and other tortures. In the words of one Oklahoma prisoner, quote, as long as prisoners confine themselves to gambling, shooting dope, running loan rackets, and killing each other, everything is fine. Let them pick up a book on Marxist theory, and they are immediately branded a communist agitator and locked in solitary confinement. In a class action suit, Warden Ralph Aaron testified that the Special Control Unit in Marion Federal Penitentiary was used, quote, to control prisoners with revolutionary attitudes and tactics. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, over 300 members of the Black Panther Party were arrested, many held without bail or trial for long durations. By long durations, I mean 2 to 3 years without a trial. At least 15 former Panthers convicted on fabricated evidence and testimony that was subsequently recanted are still in prison, some for over 20 years, including Panther leader Geronimo Pratt, who has spent 8 of his 23 years of imprisonment in solitary confinement. Pratt was charged with murdering